3 months ago, the Galactic Wildlife Conservation Station had been the crown jewel of interspecies cooperation, a shining example of what advanced civilizations could accomplish when they put their collective minds to preserving the universe's most magnificent predators. The facility orbiting Andromeda Prime had been designed with enough redundancies to survive a supernova, equipped with monitoring systems that could track a fruit fly's emotional state from 3-star systems away, and staffed by the finest xenobiologists, veterinarians, and security personnel that 6 different species could produce. Today, it resembled something considerably less impressive, like, say, a psychiatric facility for homicidal toddlers with supernatural abilities. The answer to how things had gone so spectacularly wrong was complicated, multifaceted, and involved more variables than most sapient minds could process simultaneously. But the short version? Someone had decided it would be a fantastic idea to gather the galaxy's most dangerous predator cubs and raise them in captivity until they were old enough to be safely returned to their natural habitats. Spoiler alert, it wasn't working out as planned. Dr. Nexara clicked her 4 mandibles in what could charitably be called frustration, though anyone familiar with Vexani body language would recognize it as barely contained hysteria. Her compound eyes reflected the flashing red alerts that had become as common as morning coffee in the past few months. The insectoid scientist stood before a wall of monitoring displays that would make a starship bridge jealous, each screen showing behavioral readings that made absolutely no sense whatsoever. The crystalline pack hunters destroyed another containment barrier last night, she announced to the morning briefing, her voice carrying that special tone reserved for people who'd given up on sanity weeks ago. That's the 3rd one this cycle. The barriers are made from compressed neutronium. They shouldn't be able to scratch them with their claws, let alone reduce them to glittering powder. Captain Gulven of Station Security, a amphibious gloomeran whose natural green complexion had taken on a sickly yellow tinge lately, raised one webbed hand. What about the psychic terror birds? Oh, those delightful little angels. Nexara's mandibles clicked in what definitely wasn't amusement. They've started projecting nightmares so vivid that 3 of our night shift technicians requested immediate transfer to active combat zones. Apparently, facing plasma cannons seemed more appealing than another shift listening to telepathic screaming. The conference room fell silent, except for the gentle hum of life support systems and the distant sound of something large hitting something metallic with considerable force. Nobody bothered to ask what that was anymore. It could have been any of their current residents expressing their feelings about captivity. Alhira, Nexara's research assistant, pulled up a holographic display that made everyone in the room want to reach for the nearest sedative. The data streams looked like abstract art created by a computer having a nervous breakdown. The Shadow Stalkers have learned to phase through solid matter, she reported with the enthusiasm of someone announcing a plague outbreak, which shouldn't be possible, because they're supposed to be juveniles. That ability doesn't typically manifest until they reach full maturity. Define full maturity, Gulven asked, though his tone suggested he really didn't want to know. About 3 times their current size, with the ability to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. A moment of contemplative silence passed before Vorthan, the facility administrator, spoke up. His gloomeran vocal sacs inflated slightly, a sure sign of impending bureaucratic panic. The Galactic Wildlife Preservation Committee is already asking questions about our success rates. If word gets out that we can't even contain juvenile specimens. Success rates? Nexara's laugh had an edge that could cut through hull plating. What success rates? The armored bristlebacks have turned their habitat into what can only be described as a strategic fortress. They've somehow figured out how to weave their quills into defensive structures that our best military architects couldn't improve upon. And they're 3 months old. The morning briefing was interrupted by a sound that had become all too familiar, a melodic wailing that seemed to resonate through the station's hull itself. Everyone instinctively covered their auditory organs. "The singing death cats again?" Gulvin asked wearily. "Always the singing death cats," Quilna confirmed from her position near the veterinary reports. The aquatic species specialist's gill slits were fluttering rapidly. Never a good sign. Their vocalizations are now registering frequencies that shouldn't exist in normal spacetime. Yesterday, one of their lullabies caused a minor temporal anomaly in Section C. Maintenance is still trying to figure out why that corridor now experiences Wednesdays twice. The really frustrating part, and oh, there were so many frustrating parts, was that the monitoring equipment couldn't find a pattern. The Galactic Wildlife Conservation Station boasted the most advanced behavioral analysis systems in known space. These weren't primitive sensors. They were quantum-level pattern recognition matrices capable of predicting a creature's next move based on the subtle interaction between their bioelectric field and local gravitational fluctuations. And they were completely, utterly, magnificently useless. "The AI systems keep giving us the same report," Alhira said, gesturing to another incomprehensible display. "No discernible pattern, no environmental trigger, no identifiable cause for the behavioral anomalies. It's like asking the most sophisticated calculator in the universe to solve an equation, and having it respond with, 'I don't know, maybe magic?'" Nexara studied the chaos of data with the kind of intensity usually reserved for solving galactic crises. "We've checked everything. Atmospheric composition, normal. Gravitational fields, stable. Electromagnetic interference, within acceptable parameters. Food quality, actually above standard, because apparently we're feeding them better than most sapient species eat." "What about the facility's structural integrity?" Vorthan asked, though his question was answered by another distant crash that made the lights flicker. "Well," Gulvin said with the dry humor that came from months of sleep deprivation, "let's just say our insurance premiums have reached levels that would make a war profiteer weep." The truth was, nobody had expected this assignment to be easy. The Galactic Wildlife Conservation Station had been designed as a rehabilitation facility for dangerous species, a place where apex predators could be studied, treated, and eventually returned to their native habitats. The theory was sound. Remove young predators from hostile environments, provide them with optimal care and behavioral conditioning, then release them as healthy, well-adjusted adults. The reality was more like trying to run a nursery during a natural disaster, while everything was on fire and the fire was sentient. "The worst part," Nexara continued, "is that they're not just destructive. They're learning, fast, faster than they should be able to learn. The Crystal Pack hunters have started coordinating attack patterns that would challenge military tacticians. The Shadow Stalkers are using their phasing abilities in ways that suggest advanced spatial reasoning. Even the Bristlebacks are showing problem-solving skills that border on genius-level intelligence. So we're basically raising an army of super-intelligent baby monsters," Gulvin summarized helpfully. "That's actually an accurate assessment," Quilna agreed. "And they're all deeply, profoundly unhappy about their current accommodations." The meeting was interrupted by Beltox, the insectoid technician, who burst through the doors with the kind of urgency that suggested either breakthrough or catastrophe. Given their recent luck, everyone assumed catastrophe. "The containment fields in Sector 9 are fluctuating," he announced breathlessly. "The singing death cats have figured out how to harmonize with the field generator's resonance frequency. They're not trying to break out. They're turning the entire containment system into some kind of musical instrument. Everyone stared at him. "And?" Nexara prompted. "And it's actually quite beautiful," Beltox admitted. "But it's also causing sympathetic vibrations in the other habitats. The psychic terror birds are using the music as a carrier wave for their telepathic projections. The whole station is starting to experience shared dreams." A moment of silence passed before Vorthan spoke up. "Shared dreams about what?" Beltox's mandibles twitched nervously. "Open spaces, wide horizons, freedom, and hunting." The implications of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket made of pure anxiety. "Right," Nexara said with the tone of someone who'd reached the absolute limit of their coping mechanisms. "Emergency protocols. We're going to have to consider sedating the entire population until we can figure out what's causing this behavioral cascade." "We've tried sedation," Quilna reminded her. "Their metabolisms adapt faster than we can adjust dosages. The last attempt resulted in the armored bristlebacks becoming hyperactive instead of docile. They spent 6 hours redesigning their habitat's ventilation system for optimal airflow dynamics." "They redesigned the ventilation system?" "For optimal airflow dynamics," Quilna repeated. "I checked their work. It's actually a significant improvement over our original design." Nexara looked around the room at her colleagues, fellow scientists, dedicated professionals who'd signed up to help preserve endangered species across the galaxy. Instead, they were slowly being driven to madness by a collection of infant predators who seemed determined to prove that evolution's greatest mistake was giving intelligence to things with really, really sharp teeth. "There has to be something we're missing," she said, more to herself than to the room. "Some variable we haven't considered. Some environmental factor that's causing this unprecedented level of agitation." Outside the conference room windows, the stars wheeled silently in their cosmic dance, indifferent to the chaos unfolding aboard the conservation station. The cubs continued their restless activities, their distress echoing through the station's corridors in the form of crystalline scraping, telepathic wailing, dimensional phasing, architectural restructuring, and weaponized lullabies. None of them could have guessed that the solution to their problem was currently somewhere in the station's administrative maze, filling out paperwork that would officially reassign him from waste management duties on a mining platform to janitorial services aboard their floating menagerie of impossibly dangerous baby animals. But that's bureaucracy for you, always full of surprises, and rarely the good kind. Zane Watanabe had exactly 3 things going for him in life: an uncanny ability to make industrial cleaning equipment perform like precision instruments, a talent for finding humor in the most absurdly bureaucratic situations, and the kind of spectacular bad luck that could turn a simple job transfer into an interstellar comedy of errors. Which was how he'd ended up mopping floors next to creatures that could theoretically eat him for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a midnight snack without breaking a sweat. The paperwork had been clear, or at least as clear as galactic bureaucracy ever managed to be. Janitorial duties aboard mining platform Delta 9, Sector 12, waste processing facilities. Simple, straightforward, and about as far from dangerous as you could get in a universe where vacuum-sealed toilets occasionally achieved sentience and tried to file labor complaints. Instead, some cosmic filing error had deposited him aboard the Galactic Wildlife Conservation Station, where his job description now included maintaining cleanliness standards in proximity to apex predators that haven't figured out the concept of inside voice yet. "Well," Zane muttered to himself as he reviewed his duty roster, "at least the pay grade's the same." His first shift had been educational. The orientation briefing had been delivered by a visibly stressed Vexani technician, whose compound eyes kept twitching every time something crashed in the distance. The safety protocols alone had taken 2 hours to cover, and most of them boiled down to, if you hear screaming, telepathic, audible, or interdimensional, evacuate immediately and let security handle it. Zane had nodded along politely, signed the appropriate liability waivers, and privately wondered if his life insurance premiums were about to skyrocket. But here's the thing about humans, and this is important because most of the galaxy tended to overlook this particular detail. They were remarkably adaptable. Not in the flashy, obvious way that made for good Hollywood documentaries, but in the quiet, persistent manner of a species that had spent millennia figuring out how to coexist with everything from house cats to grizzly bears. So, when Zane began his first night shift, pushing his cleaning cart through the dimly lit corridors of the conservation station, he approached the task with the same methodical efficiency he'd brought to every other job in his thoroughly unremarkable career. The first sign that something unusual was happening came from Habitat Block C, where the crystal pack hunters had been conducting what could only be described as architectural warfare for the past month. These particular cubs, about the size of earth wolves, but made of what appeared to be living mineral formations, had been systematically redesigning their enclosure using nothing but their natural crystal-shaping abilities and an apparently endless supply of creative rage. The monitoring stations showed their usual readings: stress indicators in the red zone, sleep cycles completely disrupted, aggressive behavior patterns that made military strategists nervous. But as Zane began cleaning the observation corridor outside their habitat, something shifted. The crystalline scraping sounds that had been echoing through the station like fingernails on a cosmic blackboard began to slow. Then, soften. Then, for the first time in weeks, they stopped entirely. Zane paused in his mopping, listening to the sudden quiet with the kind of attention that came from working night shifts, in places where silence usually meant someone was either dead or plotting something terrible. "Huh," he said to nobody in particular, then resumed cleaning. On the monitoring level 3 floors up, Beltox stared at his instrument panel with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been politely but firmly relocated. The crystal pack hunters' stress indicators were dropping. Their bioelectric readings showed patterns consistent with rest, actual, honest-to-physics rest. "This can't be right," he muttered, running diagnostic checks on his equipment. Everything came back green. The sensors were functioning perfectly, which meant the readings were accurate, which meant the most consistently agitated creatures in the facility had suddenly decided to calm down, for no apparent reason whatsoever. Down in Block C, Zane had moved on to wiping down the observation windows, humming an old Earth song under his breath, something about blue skies and sunshine that seemed ridiculously optimistic given his current surroundings. The crystal cubs, visible through the reinforced transparent aluminum, had settled into what could only be described as comfortable positions. Their crystalline forms were still, their internal light patterns cycling in slow, regular rhythms that suggested deep, peaceful sleep. It was the first time they'd slept properly in months. Zane finished cleaning the windows and moved on to the next section, completely unaware that he'd just accomplished something that 3 months of advanced xenobiology, cutting-edge technology, and desperate improvisation had failed to achieve. Habitat Block D housed the psychic terror birds, and the less said about them, the better. These particular cubs looked like someone had crossbred a peacock with a fever dream, then given the result telepathic abilities and a deeply pessimistic outlook on existence. Their previous evening's activity had included projecting nightmares about being trapped in an endless bureaucratic meeting where every form required 17 different signatures in languages that didn't exist yet. Zane's cleaning cart squeaked slightly as he rounded the corner into their observation corridor. The squeaking should have been enough to trigger their standard response, a telepathic shriek that could give a seasoned warrior existential dread. Instead, one of the cubs lifted its iridescent head, fixed Zane with a look of what could almost be called curiosity, and settled back into its nesting material with something that sounded remarkably like a contented sigh. "Well, that's new," Zane observed, then got back to work. 3 floors up, Alhira was experiencing what could charitably be called a professional crisis. Her monitoring equipment was registering normal brain activity patterns from the terror birds for the first time since they'd arrived. Not sedated normal, not exhausted normal, but genuinely, naturally peaceful normal. She ran every diagnostic test she could think of. The equipment was fine. The readings were accurate. The terror birds were actually impossibly relaxing. By the time Zane had made his way through blocks E and F, the shadow stalkers and armored bristlebacks respectively, word had begun to spread through the night shift that something unprecedented was happening. The creatures that had been driving the station's staff to the edge of madness were exhibiting normal, healthy behavioral patterns. The shadow stalkers, instead of phasing through their containment barriers in an endless quest to escape, had curled up in the comfortable shadows of their artificial cave systems. The armored bristlebacks had abandoned their fortress construction project in favor of what appeared to be a group nap. And in Block G, the singing death cats had done something that nobody on the station had heard in months. They'd gone quiet. Zane paused outside their habitat, struck by the unusual silence. Through the observation window, he could see the cubs, beautiful, terrible creatures that looked like someone had given house cats the ability to manipulate sound waves and a subscription to a very dark music streaming service, curled up together in a peaceful pile of fur and contentment. "That's nice," he said to himself. "Everyone needs their beauty sleep." One of the cubs opened an eye, looked directly at him through the window, and made a sound that was barely audible. A soft, musical trill that somehow conveyed both gratitude and recognition. Zane smiled, gave the cub a small wave, and continued on his rounds. By morning, the station's day shift arrived to find something that hadn't happened since the cub's arrival. A quiet facility. No emergency alerts, no containment breaches, no reports of telepathic nightmares or interdimensional phasing incidents. Nexara arrived at her office to find Alhira already there, surrounded by printouts and data tablets, with the expression of someone who'd discovered that gravity occasionally worked sideways. "Tell me you have an explanation for this," Nexara said without preamble. "I have readings," Alhira replied, which wasn't quite the same thing. Every single habitat showed normal behavioral patterns starting at approximately 2300 hours last night. Sleep cycles resumed normal patterns. Stress indicators dropped to baseline levels. Aggressive behaviors ceased entirely. Environmental changes? None detected. Atmospheric composition remained constant. No fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, gravitational anomalies, or quantum resonance patterns. Nexara studied the data with growing bewilderment. What about the facilities themselves? Any changes to the habitats? Only routine maintenance. The night cleaning crew serviced the observation corridors, but that's standard procedure. The cleaning crew? Nexara's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. Who was assigned to that sector? Alhira consulted her duty roster. New transfer. Human designation Zane Watanabe. Reassigned from waste processing duties due to administrative error. They looked at each other for a long moment, the kind of look that passed between professionals who'd just stumbled across something that made no sense but was too significant to ignore. "Get me his personnel file," Nixara said, "and prepare a full environmental analysis of every area he cleaned last night. If there's a correlation, I want to find it." But as they would soon discover, correlation and causation were very different things. And sometimes the most important factors couldn't be measured by even the most sophisticated instruments in the galaxy. Sometimes the answer was simpler and more complex than anyone expected. Sometimes it was just human. 3 weeks into what was rapidly becoming known as the Zane phenomenon, the Galactic Wildlife Conservation Station had transformed from a floating asylum into something resembling an actual conservation facility. The change was so dramatic that visiting inspectors from the Wildlife Preservation Committee had initially assumed they'd been given the wrong coordinates and spent 20 minutes arguing with station control about whether they were at the correct location. Dr. Nexara stood in the main observation deck, watching scenes that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. The crystal pack hunters were engaged in what could only be described as play behavior, carefully constructing temporary structures that they then knocked down with obvious delight, their internal lights flickering in patterns that resembled laughter. The psychic terror birds were practicing vocalizations that, while still mildly telepathic, now projected feelings of curiosity rather than existential dread. Most remarkably, the singing death cats had begun harmonizing with the station's ambient sound systems, creating background music that was actually pleasant to listen to. The maintenance reports now included a section for ambient musical improvements to work environment. "This should be impossible," Nexara muttered, reviewing the latest behavioral analyses for what felt like the 1,000th time. "Everything we know about predator psychology suggests that apex species require extensive conditioning to adapt to captivity. These cubs are thriving in ways that surpass our most optimistic projections." Alhira looked up from her data tablet, where she'd been cross-referencing sleep pattern improvements with feeding schedule modifications. "It gets better, or more confusing, depending on your perspective. The cubs aren't just adapting, they're learning at an accelerated rate. The armored bristlebacks have started constructing complex geometric patterns that demonstrate advanced spatial reasoning. The shadow stalkers are using their phasing abilities to play what appears to be interdimensional hide-and-seek. And the correlation remains absolutely maddeningly consistent. Normal behavioral patterns occur only during Zane's shifts and for approximately 6 hours afterward. During day shifts, when he's not present, stress indicators begin climbing again. Not to previous crisis levels, but enough to be statistically significant. Captain Golvan entered the observation deck with the expression of someone who'd spent the morning trying to explain the inexplicable to bureaucrats. "The Wildlife Preservation Committee wants a full report on our sudden improvement in success rates. They're particularly interested in our new behavioral conditioning techniques." "What techniques?" Nexara asked. "We haven't implemented any new protocols." "That's what I told them. They found that explanation insufficient." The three of them stood in contemplative silence, watching a group of crystal cubs who were now engaged in what appeared to be collaborative architecture. Their crystal-shaping abilities were being used to create intricate, beautiful structures that served no practical purpose except aesthetic enjoyment. "We've tested everything," Alhira said, breaking the silence. "Pheromone analysis, bioelectric field measurements, acoustic pattern recognition, even quantum resonance mapping. Zane Watanabe registers as completely, utterly normal by every metric we can devise." "Define normal," Gulvin said. "Standard human physiological parameters, average stress response patterns, unremarkable brainwave activity. His cleaning supplies test negative for any compounds that could influence behavior. His work methodology follows standard janitorial protocols. There is literally nothing exceptional about him that our instruments can detect. And yet, Nexara gestured toward the habitats, where scenes of interspecies contentment continued to unfold. They'd tried everything short of invasive medical procedures to understand the correlation. Other humans had been brought in as test subjects, maintenance workers, researchers, even volunteers from nearby colonies. The cubs remained agitated during their presence. It wasn't a species response. It was specifically Zane. "Maybe we're approaching this wrong," Gulvin suggested. "Instead of trying to figure out what he's doing differently, maybe we should examine what the cubs are responding to." "We've analyzed their behavioral patterns extensively," Alhira replied. "Increased play behavior, normalized sleep cycles, enhanced learning capacity, reduced stress indicators across all species. But the cubs themselves can't tell us why they're responding this way." "Actually," a new voice interrupted, "they can?" Everyone turned to see Quilna emerging from the habitat access corridor, her gill slits fluttering with what appeared to be excitement, rather than anxiety, for the first time in months. "Explain," Nexara commanded. "I've been working with the terror birds on basic communication protocols," Quilna said. "Their telepathic abilities make them ideal for establishing rudimentary contact. This morning, I managed to get coherent responses about their environmental preferences. And they're not responding to what Zane does. They're responding to what he doesn't do." The observation deck fell, silent except for the gentle harmonics of the singing death cats, who seemed to be providing a soundtrack to the conversation. "Every other sapient species that interacts with them projects expectation," Quilna continued. "We expect them to be dangerous, so we approach with caution. We expect them to be aggressive, so we maintain defensive postures. We expect them to be problematic, so we monitor for signs of trouble." "That's standard safety protocol," Gulvin pointed out. "Exactly. But Zane doesn't project any expectations at all. To him, they're just animals doing animal things. When he cleans their observation corridors, he's not watching for signs of aggression or calculating threat assessments. He's just cleaning." Nexara's mandibles clicked rapidly as she processed this information. "You're suggesting that our monitoring and security procedures are themselves a source of stress?" "Not the procedures themselves, but the mindset behind them. Think about it. We've been treating them like dangerous specimens that need to be contained and studied. Zane treats them like animals that happen to live here while he does his job." The implications of this revelation were staggering. The most advanced conservation facility in the galaxy, equipped with technology that could measure quantum fluctuations in individual cells, had been inadvertently stressing their charges simply by being too good at their jobs. "But that still doesn't explain the accelerated learning," Alhira protested, "or the enhanced social behaviors." "Actually, it does," Quilna said. "When animals aren't constantly stressed about survival, they have cognitive resources available for other activities. Play, exploration, social bonding, creative expression. What we're seeing isn't abnormal development. It's normal development in an environment where they're finally relaxed enough to demonstrate their natural intelligence." As if to emphasize the point, one of the shadow stalker cubs chose that moment to phase partially into the observation deck, leaving just its head visible as it looked around with obvious curiosity, before phasing back to its habitat with what sounded like a giggle. "We've been so focused on containment and monitoring that we forgot they're not just predators," Nexara said slowly. "They're children. highly intelligent children with supernatural abilities and an arsenal of natural weapons, Gulven added helpfully. Yes, but children nonetheless. And children respond to emotional environments as much as physical ones. The revelation was both humbling and revolutionary. The galaxy's most sophisticated conservation technology had been outperformed by a human janitor who simply didn't overthink the situation. "So what do we do with this information?" Alhira asked. "We can't exactly shut down our monitoring systems or abandon safety protocols." "No," Nexara agreed, "but we can modify our approach. Instead of constant surveillance for signs of problems, we monitor for signs of well-being. Instead of defensive positioning, we adopt neutral observation stances. Instead of expecting trouble, we expect normal animal behavior." "And Zane?" Gulven asked. "Zane continues his current duties," Nexara said firmly. "But now we study what he's actually doing right instead of trying to measure what we think he should be doing wrong." Over the following days, they implemented subtle changes to their operational protocols. Security maintained readiness without projecting threat assessment anxiety. Researchers observed without broadcasting expectations of dangerous behavior. The feeding and maintenance staff approached their duties with the kind of relaxed professionalism that treated the cubs as animals rather than specimens. The results were immediate and dramatic. The cubs' behavioral improvements accelerated. The crystal pack hunters began creating increasingly sophisticated structures that demonstrated not just intelligence, but artistic sensibility. The terror birds started projecting pleasant dreams instead of nightmares, sharing images of vast skies and freedom that were beautiful rather than terrifying. Most remarkably, the singing death cats began composing original music, complex harmonies that seemed to tell stories about their species' history and culture. The compositions were so sophisticated that the station's AI had begun analyzing them for linguistic patterns. "They're not just animals," Quilna announced during one morning briefing. "They're people. Young people with their own cultures, languages, and social structures. We've been treating them like dangerous pets, when we should have been treating them like refugee children." The transformation of the conservation station had attracted attention from across the galaxy. Xenobiologists requested transfers to study the unprecedented success rates. Conservation groups wanted to understand how the facility had achieved such remarkable results. Military strategists were interested in the cubs' advanced learning capabilities. But the most important change was harder to quantify. The station had become what it was always meant to be, a place where young creatures could grow and learn in safety, developing their natural abilities without the constant stress of survival or captivity. And at the center of it all was Zane, making his nightly rounds with his cleaning cart and his unconscious ability to see dangerous predator cubs as exactly what they were: kids who just wanted to feel safe enough to be themselves. The monitoring equipment still couldn't record any measurable pattern in his behavior. The instruments registered normal human parameters, standard cleaning procedures, and unremarkable environmental interactions. What they couldn't measure was the one thing that mattered most: the simple, revolutionary act of not being afraid. The crisis began at 0300 hours on what should have been the most peaceful night shift in the conservation station's recent history. Zane was halfway through his cleaning rounds, humming an old Earthfolk song about rivers and homecoming, when the station's emergency klaxons began wailing with the kind of urgency that suggested either imminent destruction or a very serious malfunction in the alert system. Neither option was particularly comforting. "All personnel to emergency stations," Captain Gulven's voice crackled through the communication system, carrying undertones of the controlled panic that came with situations that had moved beyond standard protocols. We have a Class 9 spatial anomaly approaching our position. Estimated time to impact, 18 minutes. Zane paused in his mopping, listening to the controlled chaos erupting throughout the station as emergency procedures kicked into high gear. A Class 9 spatial anomaly was the kind of cosmic event that made black holes look friendly. A tear in space-time itself that could erase anything in its path from existence in ways that violated several fundamental laws of physics. The evacuation protocols were clear. Essential personnel to escape pods, non-essential personnel to shielded areas, and absolutely everyone away from the habitat blocks, where structural failure could release dozens of apex predators into the station's corridors. But as Zane stood there with his mop in hand, listening to the increasingly frantic activity around him, he realized something that the evacuation protocols hadn't accounted for. Nobody had considered what would happen to the Cubs. In the main control center, Dr. Nexara was discovering exactly how inadequate their emergency planning had been when it came to evacuating creatures that couldn't understand evacuation orders and had varying abilities to phase through solid matter, manipulate crystal structures, or project telepathic distress calls that could drive entire crews insane. "Transport capacity?" she demanded, pulling up schematics of their emergency evacuation vessels. 14 escape pods, maximum capacity 8 personnel each, Gulvin reported. Emergency shuttles can handle another 30 individuals, but they require manual piloting through the anomaly field. What about the Cubs? The silence that followed that question was pregnant with implications that nobody wanted to voice. The habitat containment systems weren't designed for emergency transport, Alhira said quietly. Moving them would require specialized equipment we don't have and time we don't possess. So we're abandoning them? "We're saving who we can save," Gulvin said, with the tone of someone who'd made impossible decisions before and hated every moment of it. In Habitat Block C, the Crystal Pack hunters had begun responding to the station's distress by creating defensive structures with increasing urgency. Their internal lights were flashing in rapid, agitated patterns that suggested they understood something terrible was approaching. The psychic terror birds were projecting waves of confusion and fear that were making the emergency personnel's jobs considerably more difficult. And throughout it all, the monitoring equipment continued to register readings that made perfect sense and absolutely no sense simultaneously. The Cubs' stress levels were climbing toward critical, but their behavioral patterns suggested they were trying to help rather than simply panicking. That's when Zane made a decision that was either brilliantly intuitive or spectacularly stupid, and given his track record, it could easily have been both. Instead of heading to the designated emergency shelter, he continued his cleaning rounds. "Zane Watanabe, report to Emergency Station 12 immediately," came the announcement over the communication system. Zane switched off his comm unit and kept walking. The first habitat he reached was Block G, where the singing death cats were producing harmonics that were no longer beautiful background music, but something that sounded like a funeral dirge composed by creatures who understood that death was approaching and were determined to face it with dignity. "Hey there, beautiful," Zane said to the nearest cub, his voice carrying the same casual warmth he'd used for months. "Bit of a rough night, huh?" The cub looked up at him, its eyes reflecting the emergency lighting in patterns that seemed almost like relief. It made a soft sound, not quite a purr, not quite a song, but something that conveyed recognition and gratitude. "Yeah, I know," Zane continued, settling into the cleaning routine that had become as natural as breathing. "Big scary thing coming our way. But you know what? We're going to be okay. All of us." In the control center, Alhira was staring at her monitoring displays with the expression of someone whose reality had just been gently but firmly relocated to a different dimension. "The Cubs in Block G," she announced. "Their stress indicators are dropping." "That's impossible," Nexara replied, without looking up from the evacuation coordination displays. "The spatial anomaly is generating gravitational fluctuations that should be affecting every living thing on the station. Nonetheless, they're showing signs of calming down, and—" Alhira paused, running additional scans. "The harmonics they're producing are shifting. Instead of distress calls, they're generating what appears to be structural resonance frequencies." Structural resonance for what? Before Alhira could answer, reports began coming in from throughout the station. The Crystal Pack hunters had stopped creating defensive barriers and started constructing something that looked like geometric lattices designed to distribute and absorb impact forces. The Shadow Stalkers were phasing in and out of solid matter in coordinated patterns that seemed to be testing the integrity of the station's hull. The armored bristlebacks had abandoned their nesting areas and were systematically reinforcing weak points in their habitat's structural framework. And the psychic terror birds had stopped projecting fear entirely. Instead, they were broadcasting something that felt like determination mixed with protective instinct. "They're not panicking," Quilna said, her voice filled with wonder. "They're trying to help save the station." In Block C, Zane was having a conversation with a crystal cub that any xenobiologist would have paid a year's salary to witness. "See, the thing about space-time anomalies," he was explaining while wiping down the observation windows, "is that they're really just cosmic tantrums. The universe gets a little upset about something and starts bending the rules of physics until someone figures out how to calm it down." The cub tilted its crystalline head in a gesture that looked remarkably like attentive listening. "But here's what the universe doesn't account for," Zane continued, "is that sometimes the best way to handle a tantrum is to not panic about it. Just keep doing what you're supposed to do, stay calm, and let the tantrum run its course." The cub's internal lights began pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm. Around the habitat, the other crystal cubs began synchronizing their light patterns, creating a display that was both beautiful and somehow reassuring. "That's right," Zane said approvingly. "Just like that. Nice and steady." In the control center, the impossible was happening. The Cubs' coordinated efforts were actually having a measurable effect on the station's structural integrity. The Crystal Cub's geometric constructions were reinforcing weak points in the habitat sections. The Shadow Stalkers' phasing activities were somehow redistributing stress across the hull's framework. The armored Bristleback's construction work was creating additional support structures that engineering hadn't thought to install. Most remarkably, the singing Death Cat's harmonics were generating vibrations that were actively counteracting the gravitational fluctuations from the approaching anomaly. "This should not be possible," Nexara said, watching displays that showed station integrity improving rather than deteriorating as the anomaly approached. "Define possible," Gulvin replied, his attention split between evacuation procedures and the growing realization that they might not need to evacuate after all. Juvenile predator species should not possess the cognitive capacity for coordinated engineering solutions to cosmic-level threats. Their neural development shouldn't support this level of complex problem-solving, and their understanding of advanced physics should be non-existent. "Maybe," Alhira suggested quietly, "we've been underestimating what they're capable of when they're not constantly stressed about survival." As the spatial anomaly reached its closest approach to the station, something unprecedented occurred. Instead of the catastrophic structural failure that everyone had expected, the station rode through the gravitational distortions like a ship weathering a storm. The Cubs' coordinated efforts combined with the station's original engineering, created a resilience that no single system could have achieved alone. When the anomaly passed and the emergency alerts fell silent, the station remained intact, fully functional, and occupied by a collection of predator cubs who had just demonstrated intelligence and cooperative behavior that redefined everything the galaxy thought it knew about apex predator development. Zane finished his cleaning rounds as if nothing unusual had happened, stopping to give each group of cubs an encouraging word and a friendly wave. To him, they'd simply done what any reasonable creatures would do when their home was threatened. They'd worked together to protect it. The monitoring equipment, predictably, had failed to record any coherent pattern in the cubs' behavior during the crisis. Their instruments showed coordinated activity, but couldn't identify the command structure, communication methods, or decision-making processes that had made such cooperation possible. But in the aftermath, as the station's staff began to understand what had actually occurred, a new picture emerged of what the conservation facility had become. It wasn't just a rehabilitation center for dangerous predators. It had evolved into something like a school for young sapient beings who were learning to use their abilities constructively rather than destructively. "They saved us," Quilna said during the post-crisis briefing, her voice filled with awe. "Not just helped, actively saved the entire station using abilities we didn't even know they possessed." "Because they felt safe enough to try," Nexara added. "For the first time since their arrival, they weren't focused on survival or escape. They were focused on protecting their home." And at the center of it all was the human who had never tried to be anything more than a competent janitor, whose greatest talent was the unconscious ability to treat dangerous predator cubs like what they actually were. Intelligent children who just needed someone to believe they could be better than their instincts suggested. The galaxy's most advanced monitoring systems still couldn't measure the pattern behind Zane's success. They couldn't quantify trust, couldn't calculate the value of treating someone with simple dignity, couldn't record the frequencies of genuine care disguised as casual conversation. But they didn't need to measure it. They could see the results: a station full of cubs who had learned that they could be protectors instead of predators, creators instead of destroyers, and partners instead of threats. Sometimes the most important patterns couldn't be recorded by any instrument in the universe. Sometimes they could only be lived, one quiet conversation at a time, by someone who understood that the difference between a monster and a hero was often just a matter of who believed in you. And sometimes the best thing you could do for the galaxy's most dangerous predators was exactly what Zane had been doing all along. Treat them like they were worth saving, and trust them to prove you right.